And now we continue our fall camp reports with Utah and our friend Michelle Bodkin out in Salt Lake City. Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm doing so good. How are you,
Good.
Tim?
I'm good. I'm good. It's almost football season. I was doing some scheduling today and I'm like, okay, I got next week. I'm real busy. And then the week after that is game week. It was
I
like, what?
know. It's
It's
here.
not, I
Finally.
know
Let's
it
go.
is. It is. Well, we're going to talk about the Utes. They're the
Mhm.
favorites to win this conference, and for good reason. This is a really good team, really good coach, incredible coach, and a proven quarterback. But give me your view on where this team is right now at this point of fall camp.
I think they're exactly where they want to be. I just recently said on X, I think the one thing that's really stood out about this group from start to finish and top to bottom is just the confidence, the overall confidence. And it's not like a cocky thing. It's not a we're going to go in and whoop everybody. It's not that sort of thing. They're just confident within themselves as to what they have, what they're going to look like as a team. I think they believe that there's there everybody can kind of step up and contribute when needed. They just feel really good about themselves internally. And I don't think I've covered this team for 11 years now, and I think this is probably the most confident group I've seen this early on. So it's going to be fun to see what that actually looks like in game time
Yeah,
situations and against actual opponents. But in the here and now, that's probably the biggest thing that stood out.
it's always fun when you recognize that in the team you're covering. Like they got something going on and they know it.
Mhm.
That's kind of cool. What's the key strength of this offense?
I think it starts and ends with Cam
Yep.
Rising. I know that there's a bunch of different things that we could list and go off as to why it's a strength or why it's going to be an important factor for this Utah offense, but I think everything moves with Cam Rising, and I think last year was so demonstrative of that. The offense was just a shell of itself without Cam running the show.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, having him back, having him be able to run it, he knows the offense inside and out. He can check down, call plays, change plays at the line of scrimmage. There's just things that he sees because of the experiences he's already had that I think makes him a tough opponent and a tough weapon to deal with if you're on the defensive side of the ball and trying to put a stop to this Utah offense. And he's just the one that makes everything go. I think everything else is kind of useless if he's not there.
Yeah.
So to me, that's the key. That's where it all starts and ends for Utah on offense.
Okay. What would be the biggest concern on that offensive side of the ball?
I think the area that has the most questions, probably the running backs, and it's a little bit unusual for a Kyle Whittingham team. I mean, he loves to run the ball. He loves to stop the run on the defense or on the defensive side of the ball. So to say that there's maybe a few more questions about the running backs than we're typically used to is interesting, but I think there's talent there. I think we just don't know what that talent's going to do. And I think honestly, the coaches maybe need to see what it does in real game reps. It's a little bit hard in scrimmages and some of that kind of stuff. I think sometimes you have to, hold that fine line of how hard do we send them out there against our defense to see what we really have. It's a position that I think is really easy to get hurt early on and
Mm-hmm.
unnecessarily. So to me, I think things will get sorted out a lot more with that group once games are being played and guys can actually go full bore and go against actual defenses that are trying to stop them. So to me, that's the question mark, the weakness of this group. We'll see how it all comes together again for them. I think there's a couple of interesting guys. We know a little bit about Mekhi Bernard. He hasn't typically been an every down back, but maybe he could be now. And then, you have some younger, interesting guys. Jalen Glover, that's been in the program for a little bit, was starting to come on strong last season. again, can he be an every down back? And then there's this young guy named Michael Mitchell that we've heard a whole heck of a lot about, but we've never really seen him. He was running scout team last year, but so those are probably the top three guys. What they do in a game, we'll see what happens.
Okay, what is the strength of this defense?
Ooh, you know what? I'm going to go with the defensive line. I was talking with someone today, and they said we're running with guys that could honestly be starters somewhere else, and they're in our rotation. They're okay maybe being the second string guy that comes in for a play or two in relief. They just feel very good about the amount of talent that they have, both with the defensive tackles and the defensive ends. And I think you're going to see entire units be able to rotate out this year, which is actually something that Utah's typically liked to do. But again, I think it's just a caliber of player from top to bottom that they feel like they can rotate out. Again, these are guys that I think they feel like, you know, if they did want to, they could go play somewhere else and be a starter. So to me, I think that's where the strength of this defense is.
Okay, where's your concern on the defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I think the biggest question is, you know, with the defensive backs, they had to replace a lot of guys. And it's not a talent issue. It's just what do these guys do in actual game reps? You know, you're replacing a Sione Vaki, a Cole Bishop. Miles Battle was really great for them. All those guys are not there. So you're bringing in new guys and plugging them in and hoping for the best. And I think they'll be fine. The reports have been great. But again, there's always that question of, we haven't seen them actually perform in a game together. We haven't actually seen any of them really play in a game a whole lot anyway. So, you know, what is that going to look like? It's a lot of bodies, a lot of very talented guys that are now in the NFL that you're trying to step into those shoes and instantly fill.
Okay, so I think I know this answer, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. What defines a successful season for this Utah team, and what needs to go right to have that happen?
Well, I think for this team, it's playoffs or bust. I think the confidence is there, both internally, but also on a national scale. You know, they're just being held in those conversations a lot. And that's something that's kind of slowly been starting to happen for this program. You know, maybe about 5 years ago, back in 2019, I think was the first group that you kind of started hearing some little twitterings from the outside. Hey, these guys could potentially sneak into the playoff. Well, now it's expanded. And I think there's kind of this feeling of there's no excuse to not make it at this point. You know, there's just more opportunity to get there with the 12 teams and being thought of as one of the top teams in your new conference. So I think the biggest thing for them is health, right? We saw last year they were still pretty good. They held their own, all things considered, an 8-5 record when you've basically lost your entire starting offense and defense and then second string units for both of those position groups. I think it speaks well, especially when you kind of see what the Pac-12 did that last year. But at the same time, you know, what would they have been if all those guys had been available to them too? So I think that's the biggest thing, stay healthy. And I think just stay true to them. You know, they have this recipe and this formula that's worked for them for, I mean, really kind of going on 30 years, to be perfectly honest. And I think, you know, if you stray or deviate from that too much and you lose your identity, you lose your opportunity too.
Okay, I think you just answered it, but I'll ask it anyhow because it's on my notes. I got to follow the notes.
I've got to follow the notes. I hear
what
you.
likely went wrong if this team falls short of those expectations? Injuries again?
I think it could be injuries, or B, somewhere along the line, lack of discipline, which would be incredibly shocking for this group. But I mean, they live and die by discipline and playing technique sound ball. If you deviate from that, if you deviate from what the plan is and what the expectation is, that's worked so well for you for so long, I think that's kind of where you point fingers is, you know, why were we not as disciplined? Why were we not as sound?
Okay. Okay, so every schedule seems to have that one game, the linchpin game that could turn the season either way. It could really
Yes.
impact you negatively or positively. If you had to pick a game on the schedule right now for the Utes, which one would be the linchpin game?
I think it's probably early on, that first game in the Big 12 in Stillwater against
Yep.
Oklahoma State. To me, there's a couple of other ones you could maybe point to. Arizona could be potentially another interesting one. UCF maybe a little bit later towards the end of the season, depending on what they do, could be an interesting one. But I think without knowing a whole lot about what everyone's going to do or look like early on, it's got to be that Oklahoma State game. I think that's the one that, at least without any information and things to go off of, that's the one that you kind of circle and go, this one could haunt you or send you into euphoria, depending on which way it goes.
Where Oklahoma State starts with Utah and then goes to K-State the next week. They get thrown right into the fire.
Well, and Arizona too has a very similar set. It's 2 hard games and then away they go. So
Yep.
we'll see how it goes.
Speaking of that, I mean, so much of this conference is new to Utah,
Mhm.
and a lot of games where you don't have any background to compare with. How weird is this?
It's very different. It
Yeah.
is very different. It's almost like playing a bunch of out of season games or out of conference games. You know what I mean? It's like we're playing Florida like like how many times? Like 8 times, 9 times, however many times.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of people that not necessarily that familiar with, don't have a lot of history with. I think Utah and Oklahoma State have only played once in their entire histories, and it was forever ago. I don't think anybody like remembers that. I don't think anybody's alive to remember that game, essentially. So it's just kind of weird, crazy things like that. And it's not just for Utah, right? It's for these teams in the Big 12 too. It's the same story, just the opposite side of the line. A lot of unfamiliarity, but Utah's been there before. It kind of was a similar story going into the Pac-12. I mean, maybe occasionally they would play some of those schools. I think a little bit more than some of these Big 12 schools. But I mean, ultimately, you're going into a situation where you don't play these teams regularly. In fact, they typically were kind of like your treat games. Like, oh
Mm-hmm.
boy, instead of, I don't know, opening up with Southern Utah or whatever, we're playing Washington or we're playing USC. And now all of a sudden they're your conference mates. It's just kind of the same thing. So we're starting this process all over again. Of course, there's a few familiar faces. There's BYU down the street from
Mm-hmm.
us. There's, of course, Arizona State, Colorado that Utah's played with regularity. But everybody else is a little new and a little different, and there isn't a lot of history to draw upon. And if there is a little history, it all seems to be kind of very old and back in the day. So it's going to be, I think, a very fascinating first few years. Kind of getting the feel for who all these teams are and how do we fit in with these teams too.
I have a general rule of thumb that if the visiting team rode a train to get to the game doesn't matter anymore. If you're riding trains, it's too far back. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, give me your expected record for the Utes this season in the regular season.
Ooh,
Just say it.
man, I know. Oh man, there's like
You know, the
3 that I
problem with
keep
predicting 12-0 is you got no you got no wiggle room.
I
You're
know,
either
I
it's
know.
perfect or you're wrong.
You know what? I will split the 3 that I've kind of gone back and forth on. I'm going 11-1.
Okay.
There's going to be a slip up somewhere.
Well, that's the way I feel about the team I covered too. Michelle, thank you so much for your time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Utah as part of the Big 12.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. It's always a pleasure to be on.